For 55 years, Walter Grayson worked the same 400 acres outside Pine Ridge. He drove the same rusted pickup truck, lived in the same white farmhouse, and wore the same faded overalls he had worn for decades. Most people in town thought they knew everything there was to know about him. They were wrong. On a chilly Saturday morning, Walter walked into Heritage Valley Bank, carrying nothing but a folded loan application and a pair of reading glasses that had once belonged to his late wife, Margaret. His checking account contained exactly $14.37. He sat across from Brandon Hayes, the bank's new branch manager, and asked for a loan. "I need $5,000, Walter said calmly. Brandon glanced at the computer screen. $14. A savings account with less than $1,000. No visible investments. No obvious assets. The young manager barely looked at the old farmer before shaking his head. "I'm sorry, Mr. Grayson. Based on what I'm seeing, we can't approve this request." Walter nodded once. No argument. No anger. No disappointment. He simply stood up, thanked Brandon for his time, and walked out of the office. Then he stopped at the teller counter. "Morning, Evelyn," he said. The gray-haired teller looked at him carefully. "Morning, Walter. Would you mind pulling up my other account?" For a moment, Evelyn didn't move. She knew exactly which account he meant. When the screen finally loaded, a number appeared that drained the color from Brandon Hayes' face. $12,417,832. The entire bank fell silent. But Walter Grayson had never needed the money. The loan had only been a test, and the result of that test was about to change the future of Pine Ridge forever. Long before anyone in Pine Ridge learned about the Grayson Family Trust, Walter Grayson had become part of the landscape. People expected to see him. Every Saturday morning at 7:15, his pickup truck appeared in front of Maple Street Cafe. Every Sunday, he sat in the third pew at church. Every evening, he drove slowly down County Road 12 on his way home from the fields. Walter was as familiar to the town as the grain silos on the horizon. The first Saturday of April began like hundreds before it. The sun had barely risen when Walter stepped onto the porch of his farmhouse. The white paint on the railings had faded years ago. Margaret used to remind him to repaint it every spring. Now nobody reminded him. The thought made him smile sadly. He reached into his shirt pocket and touched the wire-framed reading glasses he carried everywhere. Margaret's glasses. 2 years had passed since cancer took her away, yet Walter still carried them every day. Some habits were stronger than grief. The old pickup started on the second try. Its engine rattled loudly as he headed toward town. Fields stretched across both sides of the road, green shoots pushing through dark soil. Walter knew every acre, every fence post, every drainage ditch. 55 years on the same land had taught him things no book ever could. When he reached Maple Street Cafe, Patricia Monroe already had coffee waiting. "Morning, Walter," she called. "Morning, Patricia. The usual, if it's not too much trouble." She laughed. "You've ordered the same breakfast for 20 years. Seems foolish to stop now." Walter settled onto the third stool from the left. Nobody else ever sat there. The town respected routines. As he ate eggs and toast, conversations floated through the diner. Weather, crop prices, high school baseball. Nobody paid much attention to Walter. That was exactly how he liked it. Across the room, Samuel Whitaker entered, carrying a box of hardware supplies. Samuel owned the hardware store and had been Walter's best friend since childhood. He walked over immediately. "You still alive?" Samuel asked. "Barely." "Good. I'd hate to lose my favorite customer." Walter chuckled. For a while, they talked about planting season and broken equipment. Nothing important. At least, nothing that sounded important. Eventually, Samuel noticed the folder beside Walter's coffee cup, the thick one, the one Walter rarely allowed out of the house. Samuel raised an eyebrow. You finally going to do it? Walter looked out the diner window toward the far end of Main Street, toward the bank, toward a promise he had carried for 2 years. His fingers brushed Margaret's glasses again. Yeah, he said quietly. I think it's time. Outside, morning sunlight flashed across the windows of Heritage Valley Bank. Walter stared at the building for several seconds. Then he finished his coffee. Today would be the beginning. He just didn't know exactly how much it would change everything. Walter Grayson left Maple Street Cafe and began walking toward Heritage Valley Bank. The morning air carried the smell of damp soil and fresh-cut grass. Pine Ridge was fully awake now. Trucks rolled down Main Street. Store owners unlocked doors. A few people waved as Walter passed. He nodded politely but kept moving. His destination stood 3 blocks away. The glass front of Heritage Valley Bank reflected the bright spring sunlight. Walter paused for a moment outside the entrance. Through the window, he could see customers moving between teller stations. Behind a glass office in the back sat a young man wearing a dark suit. Brandon Hayes, the new branch manager. Walter had heard plenty about him. College degree, fast promotion, transferred from a large city branch 6 weeks earlier. Efficient, ambitious, good with numbers. The question Walter cared about was whether he was good with people. There was only one way to find out. Walter pushed open the door. The familiar sound of the bell echoed through the lobby. Evelyn Harper looked up immediately. Her face brightened. Well, look who decided to visit us. Walter smiled. Morning, Evelyn. The teller stepped from behind her station. She had worked at the bank for more than 3 decades and knew nearly every customer in Pine Ridge, especially Walter. What brings you in today? She asked. Walter glanced toward the office. I need to speak with the manager. Something flickered across Evelyn's face. She lowered her voice. About business? About a loan. Evelyn stared at him. For a moment, she seemed about to say something. Instead, she picked up the phone. A minute later, she nodded toward the office. Go on in. Walter crossed the lobby slowly. His boots left faint traces of dust on the carpet. Brandon stood when he entered. Mr. Grayson, he said, extending his hand. Please have a seat. Walter sat down. The chair felt too soft, too modern. Too expensive. Brandon opened a file on his computer. What can I do for you today? I need a loan. Brandon nodded. How much? $5,000. The manager began typing. Walter watched his eyes scan the screen. The young man's expression changed almost immediately, not dramatically, just enough. A slight tightening around the mouth, a tiny shift in posture, the look of someone reaching a conclusion. May I ask what the loan is for? Brandon said. Equipment repair. Farm equipment? That's right. Brandon continued reading. Walter already knew what he was seeing. Checking account balance, $14.37. Savings account balance, $812.11. No visible investment portfolio. No retirement accounts under the customer profile. No information that told the whole story. Only information that supported assumptions. Finally, Brandon leaned back. Mr. Grayson, what collateral would you be offering? Walter folded his hands. My word. Silence. The manager cleared his throat. I'm afraid that's not sufficient. Walter said nothing. Brandon continued. Your account balances don't support an unsecured loan of this size. I see. At your age and without documented income appearing here, there's simply too much risk. Walter noticed Brandon never once asked about the farm, never asked about land ownership, never asked about assets, never asked about history. Only numbers. Only appearances. The decision had already been made. Brandon folded his hands on the desk. I'm sorry, we can't approve this request. The office became very quiet. Outside the glass wall, Customers continued moving through the lobby. Walter looked at the young manager for several seconds. There was no anger in his eyes, no disappointment, only understanding, the kind that comes when expectations are confirmed. Finally, he nodded. "Thank you for your time." He stood slowly. His right knee stiffened for a moment before unlocking. Brandon rose as well. "If your situation changes, we'd be happy to review another application." Walter almost smiled. "My situation won't change." Then he walked out. Back in the lobby, Evelyn looked up immediately. She could tell from Walter's face exactly how the meeting had gone. "Well?" she asked quietly. "About what you expected." Her jaw tightened. Walter stepped closer to the counter. The bank was nearly empty. Only one customer remained near the entrance. Walter lowered his voice. "Evelyn." "Yes?" "Would you pull up my other account?" For a second, she didn't move. Then she looked directly into his eyes. The question she had been holding all morning finally appeared on her face. "Are you sure?" Walter nodded once. "I'm sure." Slowly, Evelyn turned toward her computer, and in the office behind them, Brandon Hayes had no idea that the next 60 seconds were about to become the most important lesson of his career. Evelyn Harper stared at the computer screen for a moment before placing her fingers on the keyboard. She knew exactly which account Walter meant. She had helped open it more than 20 years earlier. Back when Margaret Grayson still walked through the bank doors every month, carrying deposit slips and carefully organized folders. Back when nobody paid much attention to the quiet couple from the farm. Walter stood patiently at the counter. Behind him, Brandon Hayes had already returned to his office. He was reviewing another file, convinced his morning was moving forward as planned. Evelyn typed a series of account numbers from memory. The screen refreshed. A new profile appeared. The Grayson Family Trust. For a second, she simply looked at it. Then she slowly turned the monitor, not toward Walter, toward the glass office, toward Brandon. The balance filled the screen. $12,417,832.64. The numbers seemed almost unreal. Across the lobby, Brandon happened to glance up. His eyes landed on the monitor. At first, he frowned. Then he squinted. A second later, he stood so quickly, his chair rolled backward into the wall. Walter never turned around. He didn't need to. He already knew exactly what was happening behind him. The bank had gone completely silent. Even the customer near the entrance stopped filling out paperwork. Brandon stepped out of his office. His face had lost all color. "What?" The word barely escaped his mouth. Walter looked at Evelyn. Not Brandon. Not the screen, just Evelyn. "I appreciate your help." She nodded slowly. Neither of them mentioned the number. They didn't need to. Finally, Brandon reached the counter. "Mr. Grayson." Walter turned. The young manager looked completely different now. Gone was the confidence. Gone was the certainty. All that remained was confusion. "You have a trust account?" Walter studied him quietly. "Looks that way." Brandon glanced back at the screen. More than $12 million. The amount kept pulling his attention like a magnet. "I don't understand." Walter's expression remained calm. "I know." The young manager swallowed. "If you had this account, why did you ask for a loan?" The question hung in the air. For several seconds, Walter said nothing. Then he answered, "Because I wasn't interested in the money." Brandon blinked. Walter folded his hands. "I wanted to meet the man running this bank." The words landed harder than any accusation. The lobby remained silent. Brandon felt every eye in the room on him. Walter continued. "You saw $14. Brandon lowered his gaze. "You saw old clothes." Silence. "You saw an old farmer." Still silence. "You never asked another question." The truth hurt because it was simple. There was nothing Brandon could argue with, nothing to defend. Walter reached into his shirt pocket and touched Margaret's reading glasses. The familiar movement steadied him. "My wife used to say you learn everything you need to know about a person by watching how they treat someone who appears to have nothing. Brandon stared at the floor. The words hit closer than Walter realized. They reminded him of someone, his father. A mechanic who spent 30 years repairing engines in a small town garage. A man Brandon had spent much of his youth trying not to resemble. Walter nodded toward the door. I've got work to do. Mr. Grayson, take care, Brandon. Not angry, not cruel, just finished. Walter walked out of the bank. The bell above the door chimed softly. Sunlight flooded across the sidewalk as he stepped outside. For a moment, he stood beside his old pickup truck. Then he pulled Margaret's glasses from his pocket. The tiny scratch on the left lens caught the light. Well, Margaret, he said quietly, you were right. He looked back at the bank, at the building where a decision had just been made. Not Brandon's decision, his own. For 2 years, he had carried a promise made in a hospital room while holding his wife's hand, a promise he had delayed because he wanted to find the right people. Now he knew the time for waiting was over. Walter climbed into the truck and started the engine. As he drove east toward the farm, he passed the empty lot behind the post office. Weeds covered most of the ground. A rusted section of fence leaned sideways near the back corner. 4 years earlier, the town's community center had stood there. Margaret had loved that building. She had spent 15 years organizing reading programs, holiday dinners, and community events inside its walls. Then the fire came. And after the fire, nothing replaced it. Walter slowed the truck. For the first time in 2 years, he no longer saw an empty lot. He saw a building. He saw a future. And before the day was over, he would begin making Margaret's dream a reality. Walter Grayson drove slowly back to the farm. The road stretched through miles of spring fields. But his thoughts were somewhere else entirely. For 2 years, he had carried a promise, not a legal obligation, not a business commitment, a promise made to the woman he had loved for more than half a century. Margaret Grayson had never cared much about money. That surprised people whenever they learned about the family trust. Most assumed that someone capable of building a fortune would have enjoyed spending it. Margaret wasn't like that. She believed money was a tool, nothing more, nothing less. The farmhouse came into view as Walter turned onto the gravel drive. The white porch stood exactly as it always had. Margaret's flower beds bordered the walkway, already showing signs of spring growth. Walter still watered them every evening. He told himself it was because the flowers deserved care. The truth was simpler. It made him feel close to her. Inside the house, he placed Margaret's glasses on the kitchen table for a moment and walked to a cabinet near the window. He removed a thick folder. The edges were worn from being opened so many times. Returning to the table, he spread the contents across the surface. Photographs, handwritten notes, architectural sketches, fundraising ideas, community surveys, every page connected to one dream. The Pine Ridge Community Center. Before the fire, the old building had been the heart of town. Margaret had practically lived there. She organized reading programs for children, holiday dinners for struggling families, budgeting classes for young couples, book clubs, volunteer drives. Every event that brought people together somehow involved Margaret. Then, 4 years ago, an electrical fire destroyed the building. No one was hurt. But Pine Ridge lost something important. Afterward, people talked about rebuilding. Committees formed. Meetings happened. Nothing ever moved forward. Life got busy. Funding disappeared. The empty lot remained. Walter picked up a photograph from the folder. Margaret stood in front of the old building smiling. She was holding a stack of books nearly as tall as she was. The picture had been taken 15 years earlier. She looked happy, She always looked happiest when she was helping someone. His eyes drifted toward the window. A memory surfaced. A hospital room. Rain tapping softly against the glass. Machines humming quietly. Margaret's hand resting in his. She had been weak by then. The cancer had taken much of her strength, but not her determination. "Promise me something," she had said. Walter remembered every word. "Anything. Rebuild it." He squeezed his eyes shut briefly. The memory remained sharp even now. "Not for me," Margaret had whispered. "For them. For the town. For the children. For the people who needed somewhere to gather," Walter had promised. And now it was finally time to keep that promise. The following morning, he drove 20 miles to the neighboring town. A small law office sat between a barber shop and a dentist office. Margaret had trusted the attorney for years. That was enough for Walter. An hour later, he sat across from the lawyer with the folder spread across the desk. "I want to establish a charitable fund." The attorney adjusted his glasses. "For what purpose?" Walter slid the photograph forward. The lawyer studied it. "A community center?" Walter nodded. "In my wife's name." The attorney continued reading through the plans. "What kind of funding are you considering?" Walter answered without hesitation. $2 million. The lawyer's eyebrows rose slightly. Even after years of practice, that number still commanded attention. Walter continued. "Construction, maintenance, educational programs, operating expenses. I want it built right." The lawyer slowly nodded. "We can make that happen." For the first time in years, Walter felt the weight of the promise begin to lift. Meanwhile, back in Pine Ridge, the story from the bank had already begun spreading. A customer had witnessed everything. By Sunday afternoon, people were talking. By Monday morning, rumors were everywhere. The old farmer everyone thought they knew had more than $12 million. And nobody could stop talking about it. What no one knew yet was that the money wasn't the real story. The real story was about to begin. And when Walter finally revealed his plans, the entire town would be changed forever. 300 miles away, Nathan Grayson sat alone in his apartment in Charlotte. The city lights stretched beyond the windows of the 20th floor, glittering against the night sky. To most people, the view looked impressive. Nathan barely noticed it anymore. His attention was fixed on the stack of papers spread across his dining table. Bank statements, legal notices, investment reports, collection letters, the remains of a life that had begun falling apart 6 months earlier. Nathan rubbed his eyes. At 48 years old, he had spent 3 decades building a career that looked successful from the outside. Corporate consulting, large clients, business conferences, expensive suits, impressive titles, the kind of life he once believed would prove he was more than a farmer's son. Now much of it was gone. A real estate investment had collapsed. Partners disappeared. Lawsuits followed. Savings vanished. The future that once felt secure suddenly looked uncertain. His phone rang. Nathan glanced at the screen. Samuel Whitaker. He frowned. Samuel almost never called, especially this late. Nathan answered. "Hello?" "Nathan." Samuel's voice sounded exactly the same as it had 20 years ago. Steady. Direct. Familiar. "Everything okay?" "No." The answer immediately captured Nathan's attention. He sat up. "What happened?" Samuel took a breath. "Your father walked into the bank last Saturday." Nathan blinked. "The bank?" "Heritage Valley." For the next several minutes, Samuel told him everything. The loan request, the rejection, the $14, the $12 million trust account. The look on Brandon Hayes' face. Nathan listened without interrupting. When Samuel finished, silence filled the line. Finally, Nathan spoke. $12 million? That's right. Nathan leaned back in his chair. The number felt impossible. His parents had lived in the same farmhouse his entire life. The same truck, the same furniture, the same routines. Nothing about their lives suggested extraordinary wealth. "There's more," Samuel said. Nathan closed his eyes. Of course there was. "What's Dad doing?" "He's rebuilding the community center." Nathan opened his eyes. "What?" $2 million. Samuel's voice softened slightly. "In your mother's name." For several seconds, Nathan couldn't speak. The words hit harder than the bank story. Margaret. The community center. The promise. He remembered how much she loved that place. He remembered the countless evenings she spent organizing events there, the reading programs, the holiday dinners, the children's activities. "He's finally doing it?" Nathan asked quietly. "Yeah." Samuel paused. "Alone." The single word landed like a stone. Nathan stared at the papers covering his table. 3 years. That was how long it had been since he last visited Pine Ridge. 3 years since his mother's funeral. 3 years since he stood on the farmhouse porch and promised he'd come back soon. 3 years of excuses. Work, meetings, travel, distance. The truth was uglier. Coming home reminded him of who he used to be, and for a long time, he didn't want that reminder. Samuel seemed to sense his thoughts. "Your father won't ask." Nathan swallowed. "I know. He never asks anybody for anything." "I know. But your mother would." The apartment suddenly felt smaller, quieter, lonelier. Nathan looked at the city skyline outside the window. Then he looked at the legal notices on his table. The contrast felt overwhelming. One life was collapsing. The other was trying to build something meaningful. "Why are you calling me, Sam?" Nathan finally asked. The answer came immediately. "Because somebody should." Silence returned. Long and uncomfortable. Then Samuel spoke one last time. "Your father spent 30 years being proud of you." Nathan closed his eyes. "You might want to remember that." The call ended. Nathan sat motionless for several minutes. Eventually, he reached for his laptop. He opened an airline website. A flight to the regional airport near Pine Ridge left Friday morning. One seat remained. Nathan stared at the screen. He thought about his father. The old pickup truck, the farm, the promise Margaret had left behind. Then he thought about everything he had been running from. Slowly, he clicked the purchase button. Confirmation appeared on the screen. Flight booked. Friday morning. For the first time in 3 years, Nathan Grayson was going home, and he had no idea how much that decision was about to change his life. Nathan Grayson arrived in Pine Ridge just after noon on Friday. The rental car felt strange beneath his hands. For years, he had driven through crowded city streets, surrounded by glass buildings and endless traffic. Now he was traveling down narrow country roads, bordered by fields stretching to the horizon. Everything looked smaller than he remembered, and somehow more important. The town appeared around a bend in the highway. The grain elevator, the church steeple, the water tower standing above the rooftops. Nathan slowed instinctively. Nothing seemed to have changed, yet everything felt different. As he passed through Main Street, he noticed people gathered outside Maple Street Cafe. The hardware store still stood exactly where it always had. Across the road sat Heritage Valley Bank. Nathan glanced at it briefly, the place where his father's story had become the town's favorite topic. A few blocks later, he drove past the empty lot behind the post office. Construction stakes had already been planted around the perimeter. Survey markers dotted the ground. For the first time, the project felt real. His father wasn't just talking about rebuilding the community center. He was actually doing it. Nathan continued driving. The gravel road to the farm appeared exactly as it always had. His chest tightened as he turned onto it. The fields stretched across both sides. Young crops were beginning to emerge from the soil. Memories surfaced one after another. Summer mornings, tractor rides, baseball games in the yard, Margaret calling him in for dinner. He hadn't thought about many of those moments in years. The farmhouse appeared around the final curve. White paint, green shutters, the wide front porch. Home. Nathan parked the car and turned off the engine. For several seconds, he simply sat there. Then the front screen door opened. Walter stepped outside. Neither man moved immediately. They simply looked at one another. 3 years. The distance suddenly felt much longer than that. Walter appeared older, his shoulders slightly narrower, his hair almost completely gray, but his eyes remained exactly the same, steady, kind, patient. Nathan climbed out of the car. "Hey, Dad." Walter nodded. "Nathan." Neither of them seemed sure what to say next. The years of silence stood between them. Then Walter took 3 steps forward and wrapped his arms around his son. No speeches, no accusations, no questions. Just a hug. Simple. Honest. Nathan felt something break loose inside him, a weight he had carried longer than he realized. When they finally stepped apart, Walter smiled. "You hungry?" Nathan laughed softly. "Yeah." "Good." Walter turned toward the house. "I made soup." Somehow that answer felt perfect. Inside, the farmhouse looked almost unchanged. Margaret's apron still hung near the kitchen. Family photographs still lined the walls. The old wooden table still occupied the center of the room. Nathan sat down. For a moment, he could almost believe no time had passed at all. They ate lunch quietly. Potato soup, fresh bread. The same recipes Nathan had grown up eating. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was healing. Afterward, Walter led him outside. They spent the afternoon walking the property. The north fence, the barns, the soybean fields, the creek running along the back section of land. Eventually, they reached the southern edge of the farm. Walter carried a thick folder beneath his arm. Nathan recognized it immediately, the same one Samuel had mentioned. Without speaking, Walter opened it. Architectural drawings covered the hood of the pickup truck. Floor plans, budgets, construction sketches. Nathan studied them carefully. A large gathering hall, meeting rooms, a kitchen, office space, and one smaller room near the rear. Its label caught his attention. Margaret's reading room. Nathan swallowed hard. Walter looked out across the fields. She wanted kids to have a place to read. His voice was quiet. She talked about it right up until the end. Nathan stared at the plans. The project was far bigger than he imagined, far more detailed, far more personal. "You've been working on this a long time." Walter nodded. 2 years. Nathan looked at his father, then at the plans, then back toward town. For the first time since arriving, he understood something important. The community center wasn't really about the building. It was about a promise, and his father intended to keep it no matter what. Neither man realized it yet. But before the weekend ended, that promise would become the center of both their lives. The following Thursday evening, nearly the entire town of Pine Ridge gathered inside the old Civic Hall. Word had spread quickly. Walter Grayson had called a community meeting. No one knew exactly why, but everyone suspected it had something to do with the rumors surrounding his fortune. Every seat was filled. People stood along the walls. Others crowded near the doors. Nathan remained near the back of the room, watching quietly. He recognized faces from childhood: teachers, neighbors, farmers, store owners, people he hadn't seen in years. At precisely 7 o'clock, Walter walked to the front. He carried the familiar folder beneath one arm. The room grew silent almost immediately. Walter never enjoyed public attention. Everyone knew that, which made the moment feel even more important. He set the folder on a table and looked around the room. Most of you knew Margaret. Several people smiled. Others nodded. Some lowered their eyes. The loss was still felt throughout the town. Walter took a slow breath. 2 years before she passed away, she asked me to do something. The room became even quieter. She asked me to rebuild the community center. Murmurs spread through the audience. Walter opened the folder. He removed the architectural drawings and held them up. The room leaned forward. "This is the plan." He laid the sketches across the table. "A new community center, meeting rooms, educational programs, a kitchen, gathering spaces. He paused. And a reading room named after Margaret. The silence lasted only a second. Then applause erupted. Loud, unexpected, heartfelt. Walter looked slightly uncomfortable, which only made people smile more. When the applause finally faded, he continued. The Grayson Family Trust will provide $2 million to fund construction and operation. The reaction was immediate. Gasps, whispers, disbelief. Nathan watched the room carefully. For the first time, people were no longer talking about Walter's wealth. They were talking about what he intended to do with it, and that made all the difference. After the meeting ended, dozens of people approached Walter. Volunteers offered help. Local businesses pledged support. Retired builders offered labor. Teachers suggested educational programs. The project was becoming something larger than a building. It was becoming a community effort. Across town, another person was struggling with his own thoughts. Brandon Hayes sat alone in his office at Heritage Valley Bank. The lights were off except for a small lamp on his desk. A file sat open before him. Walter Grayson's file. The full file. The one he should have reviewed before making assumptions. He stared at it for a long time. Every page reminded him of the same mistake. He had judged a man by appearances, judged him by numbers, judged him before learning who he really was. A knock interrupted his thoughts. Evelyn stepped inside. "You still here?" Brandon nodded. She glanced at the file. "Can't stop thinking about it?" "No." Evelyn sat across from him. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Brandon sighed. "I keep replaying it." "The loan?" "Everything." Evelyn folded her hands. "Then learn from it." Brandon looked up. "I embarrassed myself." "No." She shook her head. "You embarrassed yourself only if you refuse to grow from it." The words stayed with him. Meanwhile, back at the farm, Nathan and Walter sat on the porch watching the sunset. Orange light stretched across the fields. For a while, they simply listened to the wind moving through the crops. Finally, Nathan spoke. "Dad?" Walter glanced toward him. "I'm in trouble." The words came harder than Nathan expected. Financial trouble, failed investments, debt, lawsuits. Everything he had hidden for months. He told the entire story. Walter listened without interruption, without judgment. When Nathan finished, silence settled between them. Then Walter asked the simple question, "Why didn't you call?" Nathan stared at the fields. "Because I was ashamed." Walter nodded slowly, as if he already understood. After a moment, he leaned back in his chair. "I can't solve all your problems. I know. But I can give you something useful." Nathan looked over. Walter pointed toward the folder resting beside the door. "The community center." Nathan frowned. "What about it?" "I need somebody to manage the project." Nathan blinked. "Construction planning, budgets, scheduling, contractors, everything he had spent 20 years doing professionally." Walter continued. "I'm too old to run it day to day." Nathan stared at him. Even now, after years apart, his father wasn't offering money. He was offering trust, a second chance. And suddenly, Nathan understood. Walter wasn't just rebuilding a community center. He was rebuilding relationships, one person at a time, including the one sitting beside him. Nathan slowly nodded. "I'll do it." Walter smiled. A small smile, but a real one. And somewhere across town, Brandon Hayes was preparing to ask for a second chance of his own. Groundbreaking began on the first Monday in June. By 7 o'clock that morning, Nathan Grayson was already standing on the empty lot behind the post office, holding a clipboard and reviewing construction schedules. The sight would have seemed strange to anyone who knew him years earlier. For most of his adult life, Nathan had managed corporate projects from glass office towers. Now he was standing in work boots on a patch of dirt in Pine Ridge, and he had never felt more invested in a project. The construction crew arrived shortly afterward. Concrete trucks followed. By noon, Equipment filled the lot where weeds had grown for years. Walter stood quietly near the edge of the property. His hands rested behind his back as he watched the work begin. Beside him stood Samuel Whitaker. Neither man spoke much. They simply watched. After a while, Samuel nodded toward the activity. Margaret would have liked this. Walter smiled softly. Yeah. For the first time in a long while, the empty lot no longer looked empty. It looked alive. The weeks passed quickly. Nathan threw himself into the project. Budgets, schedules, contract negotiations, permit approvals. Every detail crossed his desk. The work was demanding, but unlike his old career, this project felt meaningful. Every decision affected people he actually knew. Every improvement would benefit the town his mother loved. The purpose changed everything. One afternoon, nearly a month into construction, Brandon Hayes appeared at the site. Nathan noticed him immediately. The banker stood awkwardly near the entrance, hands in his pockets, unsure whether he was welcome. Several workers recognized him. A few exchanged glances. The story of the denied loan hadn't been forgotten. Brandon walked toward Walter. I was hoping we could talk. Walter looked up from the plans he was reviewing. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Walter folded the papers and nodded. Go ahead. Brandon took a breath. I owe you an apology. Walter listened. A real apology. Brandon stared directly at him. I judged you before I knew anything about you. The words came slowly, carefully. I looked at your clothes, your age, your account balance. I made assumptions. Walter remained silent. I was wrong. The construction noise continued around them. Hammers, engines, voices. Yet the conversation seemed strangely private. Finally, Walter nodded. Yes. Brandon almost smiled. Not because the answer was pleasant, because it was honest. Walter studied him for a moment. Then he asked a question. What have you learned? Brandon blinked. The question surprised him. After a pause, he answered, that numbers don't tell the whole story. Walter nodded. What else? Brandon thought carefully. That people deserve to be seen before they're judged. For the first time, Walter's expression softened. That's a good place to start. The conversation ended there. No dramatic forgiveness, no speeches, just understanding. But it was enough. A few days later, Brandon returned. Then he came back again and again. Soon, he was helping wherever he could, carrying materials, delivering coffee, organizing paperwork. The townspeople noticed. Some remained skeptical. Others slowly changed their opinions. After all, showing up repeatedly mattered more than saying the right words once. By August, the building's frame stood proudly against the sky. Walls rose. Roofing followed. Rooms began taking shape. One Saturday morning, Brandon arrived with his wife, Rebecca, and their young daughter, Olivia. Nathan walked them through the unfinished building. Rebecca studied the plans with genuine interest. This is incredible, she said. Olivia wandered through the future reading room and immediately claimed it as her favorite space. It's where the books go, Nathan explained. Olivia grinned. Then it's definitely my favorite. Later that afternoon, as workers packed up for the day, Walter sat alone inside the unfinished structure. Sunlight streamed through the open framing. He stood in the room marked Margaret's reading room. For a long moment, he simply looked around. Then he reached into his pocket. Margaret's reading glasses. The familiar weight rested in his hand. The room was still unfinished. Bare wood. Dust, exposed beams. Yet he could already picture children reading there, learning there, laughing there. Margaret had always been able to see possibilities before anyone else. Now, standing in the middle of her dream, Walter finally could too. And as summer slowly turned toward autumn, Something remarkable was happening. The town wasn't just building a community center. A father and son were rebuilding a family. A banker was rebuilding his character. And an entire community was rediscovering what it meant to come together. By early October, the Margaret Grayson Community Center finally looked like a real building. The roof was finished. The windows had been installed. Fresh paint covered the walls. Electricians moved through hallways pulling wire, while carpenters completed trim work and cabinetry. The project that had once existed only in Margaret's imagination now stood proudly in the center of Pine Ridge. Nathan arrived before sunrise nearly every morning. Old habits from his consulting career still served him well. The difference was that now he cared deeply about the outcome. Every room carried a purpose. Every decision felt personal. One cool Thursday evening, Nathan remained at the site long after the workers had left. He stood inside Margaret's reading room. Built-in oak bookshelves lined the walls. Large windows overlooked the town. Soft afternoon light filled the space. For a long moment, he simply stood there, thinking. Remembering, his mother would have loved this room. He could almost picture her sitting in the corner reading to children. The thought brought both comfort and sadness. A voice interrupted him. "Looks good." Nathan turned. Walter stood in the doorway, hands in his pockets, Margaret's glasses tucked safely inside his shirt. "It does," Nathan agreed. The two men walked through the nearly completed building together. For months, they had worked side by side. The distance that once separated them had slowly disappeared. Not through dramatic conversations, not through apologies, simply through shared purpose. When they reached the main hall, Walter stopped. The room was large enough to host weddings, community dinners, and town meetings, exactly as Margaret had envisioned. Nathan looked around. "We're almost done." Walter nodded. "She'd be happy." The words lingered in the quiet room. A few days later, something unexpected happened. Samuel Whitaker arrived at the farm carrying a cardboard box. It looked old, worn from years of storage. Walter was repairing a fence near the barn. Nathan happened to be helping. Samuel set the box down. "Thought it was time." Nathan frowned. "Time for what?" Samuel looked at Walter. Walter sighed, then nodded. Samuel pushed the box toward Nathan. "Open it." Curious, Nathan lifted the lid. Inside were hundreds of newspaper clippings, magazine articles, printed web pages, corporate newsletters, award announcements, photographs. Every single one featured him. Nathan stared at them, confused. "What is this?" Samuel smiled. "Ask your father." Nathan slowly looked up. Walter suddenly seemed very interested in the fence. "You kept these?" Walter shrugged. "Your mother started it." Nathan picked up an article, then another, and another. The dates stretched across decades. Every promotion, every accomplishment, every public mention. His parents had followed all of it, even when he stopped calling regularly, even when he stopped coming home, even when years passed between visits. Nathan swallowed hard. "You saved all of these?" Walter nodded once. "We were proud of you." The simple statement carried more weight than any speech ever could. Nathan looked away before either man noticed the tears in his eyes. For years, he had believed his father disapproved of the life he chose. Now he understood how wrong he had been. A week later, as construction entered its final stage, Brandon Hayes received good news. His request to remain permanently in Pine Ridge had been approved. Rebecca was thrilled. Olivia was even happier. She had already made friends in town and talked constantly about Margaret's reading room. That evening, Brandon stopped by the construction site. He found Walter standing outside the main entrance. "The transfer's official," Brandon said. Walter smiled. "Looks like Pine Ridge is stuck with you." Brandon laughed. I think that's exactly what I wanted. For a moment, they stood together, looking at the completed building. The journey between them had been remarkable. A rejected loan, a painful lesson, a second chance. Now something resembling friendship. Walter looked at the community center. The building was finished. The landscaping was nearly complete. The opening ceremony was scheduled for November. Margaret's dream was finally ready. But that night, back at the farmhouse, another important moment waited. After dinner, Walter reached into his pocket and removed a small velvet box. He placed it on the kitchen table. Nathan looked down at it, confused. "What's that?" Walter opened the box. Inside rested Margaret's wedding ring. The gold band reflected the kitchen light. Nathan stared at it silently. Walter's voice softened. "Your mother asked me to give this to you when the time felt right." Nathan carefully lifted the ring. For a moment, neither man spoke. Finally, Walter looked at his son. "She never stopped believing in you." Nathan closed his hand around the ring. Outside, the autumn wind moved through the fields. Inside, 2 generations sat together beneath the same roof. And for the first time in many years, both felt exactly where they belonged. The grand opening was only weeks away, and Pine Ridge was about to witness the fulfillment of a promise that had changed all of their lives. The grand opening of the Margaret Grayson Community Center took place on the second Saturday in November. By 9 o'clock that morning, cars already lined both sides of the street. Families arrived carrying casseroles and desserts. Children raced across the parking lot. Neighbors greeted one another with hugs and laughter. The entire town of Pine Ridge seemed determined to be there. Nathan had been awake since before dawn. He walked through the building one final time, checking every room, every light switch, every chair, every detail. Months of work had led to this day. Outside, a handcrafted wooden sign hung above the entrance. The words carved into the dark walnut read, "Margaret Grayson Community Center." Beneath the name was a simple quote Nathan had chosen from something his mother often said. "A town is only as strong as its kindest people." Walter arrived shortly before 10. He parked his old pickup near the back of the lot and sat quietly for a moment. The building stood before him in the cool autumn sunlight. For several seconds, he simply looked at it. Then he reached into his shirt pocket. Margaret's reading glasses, the same pair he had carried every day since she passed away. He turned them gently in his hands. "We did it," he whispered. Then he stepped out of the truck. Inside, the main hall quickly filled. More than 100 people gathered. Some stood along the walls. Others filled every available chair. Samuel Whitaker sat proudly in the front row. Patricia Monroe stood near the back with her teenage daughter beside her. Brandon Hayes arrived with Rebecca and Olivia. Looking around the room, he realized he had become part of the community he once misunderstood. At 11 o'clock, Nathan walked to the front. He tapped the microphone once. The room gradually quieted. Then he introduced the man everyone had come to hear, Walter Grayson. Applause filled the hall. Walter looked slightly uncomfortable. As always, he stepped to the podium and waited patiently. When the room settled, he spoke. "I'm not much for speeches." Laughter moved through the crowd. Margaret would have wanted this day to be about people, not about her. He paused, then looked around the room. She believed a town wasn't just buildings and roads. The hall became silent. She believed it was people helping each other. Walter's voice remained calm, steady. She believed that when one family struggled, the rest should show up. Several people nodded. She believed kindness mattered more than money. His hand briefly touched the glasses in his pocket, and she believed this town deserved a place where everyone belonged. He looked toward the reading room, toward the kitchen, toward the gathering spaces, then back at the crowd. So here it is. The applause began instantly, louder than before, longer than before. Walter stepped away from the microphone. His part was finished. The building now belonged to Pine Ridge. Later that afternoon, Patricia's daughter sat at the piano in the main hall and played a simple song. The room listened quietly. Patricia wiped tears from her eyes. Years earlier, when medical bills threatened to overwhelm her family, an anonymous donor had paid them in full. Walter had never confirmed it. He never would. But as she watched her healthy daughter perform, she understood. Across the room, Brandon approached Walter. "Thank you," he said. Walter smiled. "For what?" "The second chance," Walter nodded. "Make good use of it." "I will." And everyone knew he meant it. As the celebration slowly ended, families explored the building. Children filled Margaret's reading room. Volunteers discussed future programs. Neighbors shared coffee and stories. The center was already doing exactly what Margaret had dreamed, bringing people together. That evening, after the final guests left, Walter drove home. The road looked familiar. Fields stretched across both sides. The harvest was finished. Winter waited just beyond the horizon. When he reached the farmhouse, he climbed the porch steps slowly. The house was quiet, peaceful. Inside, he walked to the kitchen table. For 2 years, Margaret's reading glasses had traveled everywhere with him, through grief, through loneliness, through promises yet to be fulfilled. Now he gently placed them on the table beside the original folder of plans. Not hidden away, not forgotten, simply resting where they belonged. Walter sat down and looked out the window. Dark fields stretched into the distance, the same view he had known for 55 years. But tonight, something felt different. The ache remained. It always would. Yet it no longer felt unfinished. The promise had been kept. The center stood open. Nathan had come home. Brandon had learned. The town had been brought together once more. Walter wrapped both hands around a warm cup of coffee and smiled softly. For the first time in a very long while, he didn't need to speak to Margaret. He didn't need to explain anything. She already knew.